Catholic versus atheism. Human versus badger. Part 2 will be, how can any mortal man be said to be infallible? As the defending party, Alpha4 will open, and then I will come back with my planned rebuttal, and then we will do our unplanned rebuttals. Alpha4, when you're ready, you may begin.
Thank you. How can any mortal man be said to be infallible? Can any mortal man, specifically the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, be said to be infallible? I will argue that yes, he can be, to the extent that he is speaking about something that can be infallibly defined. I will show that for a Christian, it is Christ who decides what is infallibly true and who can declare it so. I will show where Christians, here meaning Catholics, see that directive expressed in the Bible. And I will show how this infallibility holds true, even when extended to the secular world. To do this, I shall define what papal infallibility is, and I will argue that the Pope can be said to be speaking infallibly when he meets the conditions of infallibility, which is a rare occurrence. For Catholics, and for all Christians, Christ is the measure of truth. He willed to confer a share of his own infallibility by a supernatural sense of faith. We read about this in Matthew chapter 16, verses 18 through 19, where it reads, "So I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." That is to say, Peter, or the office of Pope, was granted the ability to unfailingly adhere to one's faith. It is the job of one who claims infallibility to preserve true faith without error, deviation, or defect. A faithful truth is one that liberates. This ability is a charism. The Roman pontiff enjoys this charism by virtue of his office, yet he does so only when he proclaims a definitive act of doctrine pertaining to faith and morals. Again, we see these directives at John chapter 21, verse 15, where it says, "When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' He said to him, 'Feed my lambs.' Then he said to him a second time, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' He said to him, 'Tend my sheep.' He said to him a third time, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' Peter was distressed that he had asked him a third time, 'Do you love me?' He said to him, 'Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you.' Jesus said to him, 'Feed my sheep.'" There we go. We can infer from these readings that Matthew and John, the proclamations that would be called infallible, must confirm with the teachings of Christ. Also, they should, though they do not necessarily must, be definitional and be in accord with the bishops, the magisterium, and the ecumenical council, as these two can exercise this charism when they are in accord with each other. The breakdown is thus: these proclamations are teachings that lead their adherents to a better understanding of revelation in matters of faith, ethics, and morals. This is the same for anyone. For what is true must always be true. To quote Irenaeus, "Light does not fail because men have blinded themselves. It remains whether they see the light or not. 1 plus 1 must always be 2. Otherwise, it was never true. And once a man hits on a truth, that truth is always correct no matter what else he is wrong about. If the same man who finds 1 plus 1 equals 2 then claims that 5 plus 2 equals 10, that does not make him wrong about 1 plus 1 equaling 2. The same goes for any man concerning any truth. Even the Pope, when he talks about morals or ethics, when he talks about morals or ethical truths. So as you can see, any mortal man can be said to be infallible when he meets out the truth. And the Pope bases the truth he speaks on the words of Christ. I have shown where Catholics as Christians see these claims expressed in the Bible. And I have shown how this infallibility holds true even in a secular world. And that is my argument for infallibility. All right. Okay, you're up.
There it is. Right, here we go.
Hey, give me a second, because I'm going to do something kind of stupid.
I'm still getting ready.
All right. Okay. Let's see. Here we go. It's not gonna focus.
Nah, it's not going to show up.
All right, when you're ready.
All right. Thank you, Alpha4. Now, my opening rebuttal. How can any mortal man be said to be infallible? Humans are amazing creatures, highly intelligent primates who, through trial, error, slow progress, and constant learning, have become able to shape the world around them in dramatic ways. Humanity has come a long way over the last few millennia, but the greatest changes to society have occurred over the last few hundred years, with the preceding few thousand of slower progress in preparation. This progress has certainly not been constant. No divine path seems to have been laid out for humanity to follow. There have been many setbacks along the way, and many still cling to their ancient beliefs long past the expiration of their usefulness, sometimes to the detriment of others. In the past, this has gone so far as the destruction of knowledge gained over centuries, simply to appease the deity of the day. We will never know how many of humanity's achievements have been lost to the infallible will of the Almighty. But what about infallible individuals? There are many who have claimed such a lofty title. Jim Jones, for example, was described that way by his followers. He founded the People's Temple cult, leading his followers to commit terrible and sustained human rights abuses, attack and kill a member of Congress, camera crew, and several reporters, and eventually commit group suicide by drinking the eponymous Kool-Aid, although it was actually Flavor Aid. Another good example is the prophet of one of the larger religions, the chap whose name begins with M and had an aversion to portraits. He is considered infallible, the perfect specimen of a sinless individual. Yet in his own time he was called a savage warlord and murderer, and, by modern standards, he was a monster. Those claiming infallibility have often shown themselves to be quite the opposite, deeply flawed people who, in the worst cases, have brought pain, suffering, and death to those who follow them. I understand my opponent here is a follower of the Pope. An interesting individual, certainly, but infallible? We are discussing a guy who has compared trans people to nuclear weapons in terms of destructiveness. The guy literally advocates for exorcisms to be carried out to expel the literal devil from people. His predecessor was not a better option. being the chap who presided over the bulk of the child sex abuse scandals that have plagued the church over the last few decades, and apparently doing his best to keep the whole affair under wraps. Pope Francis is preferable in that he is a good figurehead, with his selfie taking and his car blessing. If all you want is a mascot, he's your man. On the subject of morality, though, he and the rest of the church are centuries behind the times. The Catholic position isn't that every word is infallible, though. In fact, there have only been 7 instances in history that are agreed to have been definitively so. Pope Leo on the 2 natures of Christ, Pope Agatha on the 2 wills of Christ, Pope Benedict on the beatific vision just after death, Pope Innocent condemning heretics, very innocent of him, Pope Pius also condemning heretics, Pope Pius, a different one, defining the Immaculate Conception, and Pope Pius, a different one again, defining the Assumption of Mary. These are mostly abstract definitions within Catholic doctrine, with little to no impact on the daily lives of the average Catholic. How is the infallibility of a statement determined? Only when the Pope makes it clear that he is speaking in the official capacity as pastor to all Christians and on some matter of doctrine, with the fullness and finality of his supreme apostolic authority. So, not by divine assent, but because the Pope says so. Or, in the case of popes before the concept was properly established, by group consensus of the bigwigs of the Church. So I ask you, Mr. Ivy, by what authority does he claim to speak for God? What evidence is there that he is more than a man with an opinion like any other, just in a fancier hat? That's my statement. Little too blasphemous for you?
That's my bathroom. Okay. So,
right, let me get back to my notes. There we go.
I am heavily disappointed, and I want to make sure that this is left in my comments I'm about to make before I begin. I am heavily disappointed in Bad Temper's lack of flubs. I made a tremendous amount of flubs, especially in my recording, and a giggle fit. And yet, Bad Tempered Badger did not. So on that alone, he wins this part of the argument. But that being said, I shall now make my rebuttal.
I'm sorry, I'll try and cock up the next bit.
The usefulness of ancient beliefs. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not commit adultery. I think those laws are very useful. You shouldn't eat raw pork. I think that's very, very useful. I'm pretty sure there are paleo vegans and many other health nuts who can tell you how the kosher diet is extremely relevant to today. From health to the idea that the original ancestors were vegetarians or vegans. I think those arguments are currently going on in society today. The fact that they are couched in biblical, that means figurative language, does not negate the relativity. Aristotle, Socrates, would you argue that law, republicanism, democracy are outdated ideas because they're older than the millennia? I think not. Is the wheel or bread or the knife or the sword an outdated concept? I think not. Militaries still use bow and arrows, yet we have guns and missiles. But he says that infallibility, when gone amok, has led to the destruction of knowledge. You can see this in Islam, when they destroy statues. And you can see this in my own people's history, when the conquistadors came through and destroyed my ancestors' writings, leaving us only the Popol Vuh. And just a few days ago, I read in the Bible where this command comes from. When God tells Moses to destroy all the work of the pagans. I believe it is the Amorites, to be exactly. And that all the gold is to be sanctified to the treasury. Here's the funny thing about that command. When you look at history, it wasn't actually followed. See, even human will knows the difference between a good command and a bad command. And just because there are foolish people in the world who will follow the worst ideas does not negate the good. So am I saying that the devil or Satan made these fools commit these heinous acts based on the idea of infallibility? No. For the Crusades were not done by an infallible doctrine. The Inquisition was done by a Spanish monarchy, not by the Pope. The destruction of my ancestors' lands were done by mortal men, not by the hand of God. But you say, yeah, but there were bad popes. Let's talk about a bad pope. Let's talk about Pope Borgia. Did he do horrible things? Yes. Are his children notorious for committing acts that would be considered evil in almost any society? Definitely. But did he declare any doctrine that we would consider heretical? No, he did not. No, theologically, all of his statements were pure. Personally, in his mortal human actions, he was as flawed as any other man, you or I. But theologically, in his declarations, he stayed true to the gospel. And any true pope has to do so when declaring a declarative statement. But a declarative statement in such a manner has only been declared 7 times, as my opponent here has stated today. But how do we decide how that is done? Through the consent of the laity. If the laity does not agree to submit to a papal statement, then it is not 100% infallible. For an infallible statement must be true no matter what. That is my statement and my defense. Bad-Tempered Badger, you have the floor.
All right, then. Let's see if my notes are a bit more coherent this time. The office of the Pope, through which he defines official doctrine, was built on Peter, the rock of Christianity. If I remember correctly, he was, in the doctrine, the first Pope. My opponent says Christ decides. Christ defines what is infallible, and this is laid down in a directive expressed in the Bible, which confirms the infallibility of papal statements. But the Bible cannot prove the Bible. If the Bible is a claim, outside evidence of the divine influence upon the Pope needs to be shown for it to be relevant outside the confines of the Church. Now, he says the Pope can be wrong about some things and still be infallible on others. In fact, in the course of history, there have been bad popes. There have been popes that have committed heinous acts, popes that have done political maneuvering, possible infidelity, various instances of heinous acts, but that they didn't declare heretical doctrine, that the doctrine they laid down could still be defined as holy and correct. Being wrong about one thing doesn't make him wrong about the other things. But by that metric, everyone is infallible when they're correct, and not infallible when they're not. So by that metric, everyone's infallible. So what makes the Pope special? He cited ancient edicts on murder or adultery. The advice not to eat raw pork for health purposes, couched in biblical language. I would say those are useful. Build on what is useful, but discard what isn't. There are many things still taught in religious schools that are not useful and in fact anti-scientific, anti-truth, and dangerous in the modern world. These things should be taught as history, but not as modern knowledge. Don't cling to ancient stories as well as to useful information. But the Pope declares infallibility by virtue of his office only when he proclaims definitive doctrine. Quite obscure doctrine, not relevant to most instances of society. It's almost like saying the Pope is infallible over a book he's writing, but not over society in general. Is it relevant to everyday life? Not especially. So why would you call it infallibility at all? Why not say, he is a teacher of the doctrine of the Church, and that's all he needs to be? And that's my statement.
Well, that was well done. If you're wondering why I'm not responding back after that, we're setting things on a time limit. Also, this video is going to take a little bit of editing, which hopefully my friend here will give me the courtesy of helping me do. On his, it probably won't be any problem at all because he does magic on his thing. But our next video will be on a different format where he will now take the lead and he will be in the defensive. So now it's his turn to sit and listen to me spout whatever it is I want to spout at the end. So enjoy that in the next two videos. I'm sorry about cutting it up. I know that I had promised that it would just be one long video, but trust me, we just had a video where there were so many technical issues and tiny flaws that if we had done it that way, you guys would be very disappointed with the quality. So that being said, I look forward to seeing all of you in the next video, and give a hand for the attacking side, and please like his video and subscribe and let him know where he's wrong and where he's right, and do the same for me, and we will have the next two videos up shortly. Talk to you all later.